The famous Ashoka capital from Sarnath, the Didarganj Yakshi, this gorgeous sandstone sculpture of a dancer. These are among the 100 objects that renowned art historian Dr. Vidya Dehejia has put together to tell the story of India. As she looks at how Indian art celebrated the human form with its numerous adornments and reflected intercultural encounters. Travel with her as she takes us on a fabulous journey through India's history. Dr. Dehejia, many thanks for joining us today. It's so wonderful to have you with us on a book that I have been waiting for the longest, because I've often wondered why we don't have a book like the one that you have done. And who better to do something like this than you? So I'm going to start by asking a very basic question. You're one of the subcontinent's most renowned art historians. When you looked at doing a book like this, what were the ideas in your head? What is the kind of structure or thematic narrative that you chose to opt for?
Well, first of all, I must say that I did approach it with a great degree of trepidation, because India is a country with so much of past history and so many gorgeous, beautiful objects. Was I being foolish in taking on something like this? And I kept thinking, as I was pulling the objects together, I had this sort of doubt. And finally, I said to myself, I'll tell you the thing I said to myself, that if I can get my readers to say, really, or if they could say, who knew, then I think I will have achieved my aim. So pulling together 100 objects and arranging them in a sort of a chronological sequence made sense, but it would be boring. It would be tedious. And I wanted to make it really meaningful, both for myself as I wrote it, but also for those who would be reading it. And so I finally decided that I would do it as thematic sections that would make more meaning instead of just putting them in a chronological order. And as you can imagine, the objects went in and out. The process took well over a year, much more than a year, just to decide on the final 100. Until the very last minute, there was, I need this, I must have this. How can I not have it, Some of the objects came out of my years of teaching and topics that had always been intriguing for students. And my student body, of course, the questions they've asked me over the years were sort of in some ways incorporated into the book. And then other objects were really tricky. Finding the visual for an object, for instance, was not easy. Some people have commented on the fact that a number of the objects, most of them come from sources outside of India. And some people have even suggested that, all our wonderful objects are outside this country. It's all gone out, but that's absolute nonsense. The reason for choosing objects that are in foreign collections was the ease of getting really good photographs. And you've got to admit that the images are as important as the text itself. It is the image that leads to what I have to say in the text. And collections in India, museums in India, don't have a bank of wonderful images that you can just say, I want an image of this or that. They don't have high-res images that you can print. And by and large, they're not very eager to have you come in and bring in a stand and lighting. And as for opening a case so that the glass doesn't reflect the light, that is out of the question. So in a way, I chose, it's not that I couldn't have chosen a very similar object from an Indian museum. There are vast numbers here, but I did opt to go for those that were already photographed and available.
I'm going to step a little back, and I loved what you said in the introduction to the book, that this is a storytelling of a different kind. It's the story of merchants, traders, craft people, jewelers, artists, thinkers. And in many senses, objects are not the obvious thing that you think about when you talk about history. And that's a sad thing, because in India, we have a very I would say, formal last generation way of looking at history, right? I mean, there's such amazing work has been done around art history and looking at objects as everyday things that tell stories and have layers and layers within it. So I really want you to talk about this theme and how, you kind of got this thesis or this idea going.
Well, let's start by saying that everybody writing in this mode is going to be indebted to Neil MacGregor of the Ex-British Museum and his wonderful, wonderful book called The History of the World Through 100 Objects, which was such an ambitious undertaking, and he pulled it off so magnificently. So we have that in the background. But that book, of course, was because it's based on a single museum collection, and it drew on the various curators and the people who contributed and suggested objects. Here I was confronted with the choice that I was going to make. And just another word about objects. Objects, we are completely surrounded by objects. And we take them completely for granted, but they have so much to say about us, who we are, what our aims are, what our aspirations are, what our dreams are, what we think is something we would like to be associated with. This isn't a history. History tends to be in India written around dynastic labels. So you've got the Mauryan Empire, very important, but you can look at things from the Mauryan Empire in a different context, or you're going to look at the Cholas, or you're going to look at the Sultanate, or you're going to look at pre-independence. If we get away from those labels and look at the object in a different context, we learn so much more. Let me just talk about an Islamic gravestone, tombstone, a beautiful object about 3 feet high, made out of marble, carved beautifully with a hanging mosque lamp and Islamic calligraphy. It's made in Kambat, in Kambe, in Gujarat, in the 15th century. And think about it. Automatically, you could have, if you're following the standard procedure, you would put it under the category Islamic art. But that is not the most meaningful thing about it. For me, it spoke about mobility and cosmopolitanism. And so I put it in that section. And what do I mean by that? This Islamic gravestone made in Kambe out of local marble was found in Aden. And we have found these everywhere. We found them across both sides of the Indian Ocean rim. We found them in Tanzania and Somalia. We found them in Mogadishu. We found them in Lars, in coastal Iran. And on this side, on the other side of India, we found them in Trincomalee, of course, in Sri Lanka. We found 12 of them in Sumatra, 15 of them in Java, so that this object was part of the extraordinary connections that India had with the world, and that Gujarat was, yes, it was under Islamic rule. It was part of that time. Ahmad Shah was ruling in Ahmedabad and had created Ahmedabad. But instead of thinking of it as under the category of Islamic art, if we put it into its context, its mobility, its cosmopolitanism, it was deeply admired. The marble carving of Gujarat was admired, and imams and sultans from across the world were commissioning them, and these heavy objects were being shipped out. So putting it into a different context makes a huge amount of sense. Or I could even turn to one of my favorite objects, if you want me to go on this particular issue of intercultural encounters. I have a small object, only about just under 10 inches high, an ivory figurine, a woman. And she is absolutely gorgeous. She's got a sensuous body. She's covered with adornment, with jewels, with bangles all the way from her wrist to her elbow, anklets all the way from her knee down, and ornaments of various types. And she's ivory. And she is the exact counterpart of the yakshis carved in sandstone at the stupa in Sanchi in central India. And Sanchi actually has an inscription saying one of the sandstone panels there was carved by the ivory carvers of Vidya. And Vidya is, of course, the immediate nearby town. But more important, yes, she's beautiful and she tells all sorts of stories. But where was she found? She was found when archaeologists began excavating and clearing the Roman town of Pompeii. Pompeii had been completely obliterated and covered with volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius. And Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79. Think about that, almost 2,000 years ago. And this ivory figurine was already in Pompeii. This Indian ivory figurine, probably carved in central India, had already reached in the year 79. India was never isolated from the rest of the world. And of course, there was this amazing trade between the west coast of India largely and Aden and on to the Mediterranean world. And what were the items that were being shipped out? Largely peppercorns, black pepper, ivory tusks, a fine muslin cloth that was in great demand in Rome. And, it's really interesting, the amount of pepper that went out. Recently, the scholars have found a Roman recipe book, which has 400 recipes in it. 395 of those recipes use black peppercorns. Grows nowhere in the Roman world of the Mediterranean, part of the trade from India. And this ivory figurine has gone there as part of this trade all those years ago, showing again that India was really connected in all directions from very early times. And we tend to think of globalization as something of the 20th century. It is ancient.
In continuance of this theme of interconnectedness, what I found amazing was that relief with a lot of women and wine, grape plants, and this beautiful image of women who looked like European women, So I think that's also a wonderful way of showing how multicultural society was.
Absolutely. The piece you're referring to it is in the style of what we call Gandhara, which is, of course, this Greco-Roman Buddhist art that came into Afghanistan and Pakistan and northwestern India. And it's very interesting to see who the artists might have been. Were they actually copying things that they had seen? Were they artists who were born and bred in India and were copying themes that came as part of this trade? I've already talked about trade. That trade was, of course, a land trade, along land routes most of the time for Gandhara. And yes, you've got women wearing complete Greek costume, and they are covered and in a very different way. The body of the Greek type is very different from the Indian body. It is sensuous in its own way, but very different. And it is usually not adorned so heavily. And you can have hair that is casual and flowing, while in the Indian context, it would be beautifully arranged and beautifully adorned. But yes, it speaks also, I mean, India has welcomed and has made part of its own many things that came from outside. Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's start from the first part of your book. You start way back into history. You start 500,000 years ago with a hand axe from Isampur, from the Deccan. And then you have a very interesting object, which is the anthropomorphic figures, the copper hoard culture, which I am fascinated by because there is this proliferation of these copper hoards across northern belt of India, and yet we know very little about it. So tell us about the selection of these two pieces.
There is this big gap between the end of the Indus civilization and then the historic period, just pre-Mauryan, when we get these 16 Janapadas in the Ganges area, and from the Indus Valley to the Ganges basin. And there is so little that we find in between. So these copper hoards tell us something about the skill that the culture that existed, that bridged this gap between the Indus civilization and the Maurya dynasty, or let us say the emergence of the Buddha and of the Jina and of those various holy people, was the people of that period. We don't know much about them. We don't know almost anything about them. They produce these extraordinary objects which speak of their skill. So all that we can assume is that there was a very sophisticated culture, which we just have not been able to find, that archaeologists haven't been able to reach. And one of the things about it is that they seem to have moved to the Ganges basin, and the river has silted every year since that period for more than 3,000 years or so. And there are some estimates which talk about more than 30 feet. Some people say more than 50 feet of silt that has built up, and that our ground level is very different, and that the lower levels are absolutely waterbound. So we can't get more evidence of these people. But the fact of these objects, which are in a way imperishable, their houses may have been built of brick, their pottery, all that is gone with time. But these copper objects have survived, and they are intriguing objects.
I was very surprised that you didn't pick up the Mohenjo-daro girl or the priest king, and you went for the prolific seals, which actually do capture a lot more about the Harappans than these two objects themselves. So I do want to ask you about that.
Mohenjo-daro dancing girl is a single piece, and so is the priest king. There aren't others like them, and we know very little about them. We don't know how they were used, what they signified, and who they were addressed to, or who made for whom, or what purpose. While if you look at the seals and the terracotta objects, they reflect the people who lived there. So there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of these seals. And the fact that they were, the back of some of them, some of the ceilings have got jute impression on it. So sacking, just plain sacking, that even today, sometimes you wrap books and things when you ship them. So that these were used in vast quantities and have been found in Mesopotamia as well, in far off places. So again, it talks of trade. And the terracotta objects talks about the people themselves, what they were using, what the children might have been playing with, if those are really toy carts, and that they were in vast quantities.
One of the first sections that you talk about is the idealized body, human and divine. In fact, a large part of your work has been about the sacred and the sensuous, and how they kind of are two sides of the same coin if you look at Indian art history. So I'd really like you to talk about that, because does this make India unique in a sense? The fact that the sensuous and the sacred come together?
In many ways, it does. If for the moment we set aside the Greek and Roman civilization, and I say set them aside because in the case of India, that same imagery has persisted through the ages and still has the same relevance. While if you look at Greece and Rome, it was a certain period and then it moved. So modern Greece has nothing to do with ancient Greece and Rome, but modern India has everything to do because it's the same gods and the same deities who are important. So in a way, yes, India is unique in combining that the sacred can be sensuous and that the sensuous can also be the sacred. And it seems to go back to an idea that, and this, of course, is something we gather from all the literary material, all the sacred hymns, all the poems, all the literature, which seem to imply that physical beauty went hand in hand with spiritual beauty. That spiritual elevation meant the body was also beautiful. And it's very clearly stated in the case of the Buddha, which says that each one of his bits of bodily perfection, his lion-like body, his long arms, his beautiful voice, everything they trace back to a good deed that he performed. In other words, spiritual, ethical living meant also a beautiful form. And that seems to have been very much part of the belief system.
Right. Let's look at some of the pieces that you have picked out over here. You know, the most famous, of course, is the Didarganj Yakshi, for instance. She's not divine, but she has all the qualities of a Yakshi. And the Yakshis played such an important role in temple sculptures and, you know, all of that. So take us through some of the pieces that you did put together in this section.
It's the Didarganj Yakshi is there because it shows us how very early this belief existed. She may be Mauryan, she may be a little later. I prefer to put her a little later, but it's irrelevant for our purposes today. From a very early point, you've got this figure of this woman. She is standing proudly, quite unlike some of the Greek and Roman sculptures, which you may say also show Venus and people like that. But Venus is always trying to hide her body and turning away. But this is a person who is proudly standing there. And it is a body that reflects fortune. I was going to use the word auspiciousness. It's such a clumsy English word. If we use Shubha or Mangala, it means much more. It has a resonance, so that it is a form that brings fortune. It is fertility, but fertility in this context brings abundance and prosperity. And it is the abundance of the field, it is the abundance of the trees, it is also the abundance of woman herself, who is fortunate enough, men don't have this fortune, of actually producing a human being within them. So woman becomes a symbol of the auspicious. She is auspicious, and she is to be portrayed. We have texts of a later period that sort of say your Nari Bandha, the panel of women on a temple, is what makes a temple beautiful and makes it bear fruit, makes it fortunate for people. So woman becomes an emblem, and woman with the emphasis on the life-giving ability of woman, that is the broad hips that help her to bring forth progeny, the breasts that produce the milk. So woman becomes an emblem of fortune. And I also want to speak very briefly about the fact that God and goddess are often shown in embrace across the country. In the book, I have only given you one example of it's over 6 feet tall, and it comes from Odisha. But those sort of images of the god with the goddess seated beside him, the goddess Uma in the case of the image I have in the book, but also Lakshmi. Uma has her hand around her consort's neck, and Shiva has his arm around her breast. They are a loving couple. It is conjugal bliss. It is married love that is being celebrated, and it's being celebrated at the highest level, the level of God and goddess. And what I want people to do is to think of these images in terms of prasad. So when Hindus go to a temple, you take a tray of offerings with you. Could have a banana, a coconut, some flowers, and the priest takes it from you, he offers it to the deity, and very often he will give you one blossom back as prasad, or something that the god has blessed as prasad. So in these type of images and the poems that are offered by poets, of the joy of the god and goddess, their married love is something you offer it to the temple. It is installed in the temple, and a little bit of that is you are requesting it back to you as that same joy in marriage that you are requesting. It's quite clearly stated in some of the inscriptions. It sort of says, may Shiva, who enjoyed the embrace of Parvati, give you that delight. Or may Lakshmi's hand, which is embracing the neck of Vishnu, bless your marriage. You know, it's something that actually needs emphasis. It's married love that is being put forward as, I don't think any other culture has ever expressed this in quite this extraordinary a manner.
Another very interesting theme, and it's something that's spoken about, though there's so much of rhetoric around it these days that we don't want to really delve too much. But I think you made a very interesting parallel about the thread of yoga, the posture, from the Pashupati seal. I mean, what we call the Pashupati seal from the Harappan times, to the great Mahabalipuram, fresco of Shiva as the ascetic, the coming down of the Ganges. So do talk about that on the reason you put it out there.
I think yoga has become something worldwide. It's one of India's exports, shall I say, an idea and a concept and a belief system that is followed everywhere. I mean, in the US, there are yoga studios at every corner. I mean, and yoga has become a very major part of life. It is now becoming a part of the expanded medical system even. Acupuncture has been there, and yoga is now being put out there. So it is one of those exports of India. And of course, the lotus posture is probably one of those contributions of India to world iconography, if you want to call it that. And it's because it's so obvious in a way that people living in a culture in which it was quite customary to sit on the ground, or if you were sitting on a throne, you sat the same way. You didn't necessarily put your feet down. You again sort of sat cross-legged in that sense. And yoga seems to have been an obvious development. It's there long before the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and it persisted right into the present day. Of course, we have to say that the yoga that's practiced outside of India in yoga studios is just that first step in yoga, which ends with samadhi, with with enlightenment. But that one, yoga asanas, postures, has become so popular around the world. And also there's been some discussion about the fact that maybe standing poses are a very recent introduction. And so I just wanted to bring in the Mahabalipuram major relief, both Shiva, it's the ascetic in front of Shiva, and the little false ascetic cat, part of the story, are standing in Vrikshasana, what they call tree pose today. And so it is at least that old. That is, it was already in place by 700 and probably well before, because you don't put something brand new necessarily into a relief of sacred significance. So it seemed to me that yoga was something that it would be good to bring in, a different body from the sensuous body, the disciplined body, maybe.
The most spoken about celebration of the body is, of course, the Nataraja. I mean, there's so much that has been written about it. You have done extensive work on it. What stands out? Because it's so iconic, Dr. Dehejia. Every time you see it, you're just wowed by it, right? You see it's very prolific, and yet it is unique in that sense.
Yes, it is. And one can talk about its beauty, which, of course, is something that the saints in South India, when they were writing their poetry, were appealing to masses of people. And so instead of focusing on the philosophic aspect of the creation and the recreation of the world, which they left it to the acharyas to explain that, instead they just talked about the beauty of this form. And it's probably the beauty of it, the way it balances the fact of the aureole, that circular aureole around it. And interestingly, it is a form of dancing Shiva that is only there in the South. There are forms of dancing Shiva everywhere, in Eastern India, in Northern India, in Western India, and Central India, but none of them with this particular posture, standing on one foot with the other foot raised, with the hands in the way in which they are. And the raised foot, of course, signifies deliverance to this individual soul. Interestingly, we refer to it always as Nataraja. It's a term that only came to be used in the 13th century, and images of this form of dancing Shiva were made throughout the Chola period, and the Cholas never referred to it as Nataraja. It's an interesting little tidbit of information. They have any number of names. They call him Manikya Kutar, the ruby dancer. They call him Arbuda Kutar, the wondrous dancer. They call him the dancing lord. They call him all these things. Nataraja comes in the 13th century, not in a Chola inscription. So it comes from the further south. It's used then for the first time. And then, of course, it just takes over. It becomes, in later Tamil literature, it's Nataraja. But at that time, it was.
I didn't realize that. That's really interesting. Another area that you have spoken about, which I'm so glad you did, was on adornment. India, I mean, you go to any temple, you go to a Ran Ki Vav, you go to any of the temples in the south, in the north, anywhere. The adornment is what stands out. And you've picked out 2-3 beautiful pieces, all of which come from the time when Sanchi was being made, when the Indo-Roman trade was at its height, the broadly Satvahana period, where the Pompeii Lakshmi comes from. It's a period of artistic excellence. And the 2 pieces of jewelry that you have also shown are from that period. Tell us about what made you pick these 2.
It's unfortunate that gold jewelry hasn't survived. We know that it was there everywhere. We've got all the literature which describes courts of the kings and all it talks about the jeweled adornment, but none of it has survived. And in a way, gold is recycled, right, in India. You pass it on from generation to generation. You might remodel it to the current fashion and make it slightly different. But and gold is everywhere, as you know, in India. I mean, it's the one thing that every young girl has to have that marriage necklace. And the jewelry that I picked was because it shows us how early on goldsmiths were as talented and as extraordinary in their work as they were. The pieces I chose, which do reflect Barhut and Sanchi and all those early Buddhist sites, where you see these sort of ornaments, and they're not just a fiction of imagination, they actually existed. And they were these granulated objects, and granulation is an extraordinary technique where you make the basic shape first, and then you take hundreds of tiny little balls of gold, and the skilled goldsmith attaches them to it. And he uses glue mixed with copper. And then when it's heated, the copper melts at an earlier point from gold. So the copper melts very early, and those little pieces, those tiny little balls of gold, adhere to the surface. So it's a very highly sophisticated and complex technique. And ornament, yes, the urge to adorn is there everywhere across the world. But in India, it also has this other level of connotation that it makes the body whole. It makes it complete. You must have adornment. And then if you want to think about it, not being adorned can bring misfortune. And you can think of Draupadi in the Mahabharata and how she undoes her hair and takes off all her jewels and says, I will not bind this back until I've had my revenge and got the blood of the Kaurava who. So in a way, adornment is, again, the same word, Shubha. It is Mangala. It is fortunate. You must wear your jewelry. And India is probably the one country in which everybody has some item of jewelry. Even the most modern of modern tend to have either a earring or a ring or something which you normally don't see in other parts of the world, in which jewelry is put on only for a special occasion. In India, jewelry is generally worn. Some item of jewelry is generally worn every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And that shows the continuity of ideas, right? I mean, and that's why we call ourselves live history, because we have all of those continue. Let's go to some of the sections where you have moved outside the realm of objects. You've gone into the written word. You have gone into areas which talk about the idea of kingship. You've talked about science as a way of looking at it. So take us through the thinking behind this, moving out of objects into these areas when you're talking about them representing the story of India.
Well, to me, the written word, let's take the written word, particularly the written word that is inscribed into stone, say, or into copper plates. It is the written word, but it's also an object, which you do have to consider as an object. If you look at Ashokan writing and you see the column on which the writing is, it is an object. It is an object which, if you were fortunate, you could read it yourself, but otherwise, as Ashoka had commanded, his officers would read it out to you. So it is an object in itself. And you look at temple walls, Chola temple walls that are covered with inscriptions, so much so every single inch of space on the wall. So the wall, that stone itself becomes an object that carries a visual significance and a more than visual significance, it seems to me.
On the issue of kingship, I mean, I know that there is a tendency to obsess about dynasties in India, like you have said, but your selection of rulers and the objects around them are very interesting. You've got Buddha as a Chakravartin from the Gandhara school. You have that famous body of Kanishka, which is in the Mathura Museum. You have the king who made, of course, you have Samudragupta, but you also have the king who made, who commissioned the Konark temple. So, and each of these actually represents a different school of art.
It does. It also, I think, represents a different ideal of kingship, that there wasn't just one ideal of kingship, that in the case of Kanishka, he was making a statement when he had himself portrayed wearing this stiff, probably woolen felt robe that stands out as a triangular silhouette, and the fact that he's wearing boots, padded boots, all of which speaks back to his original origins and his homeland. And that is the image that he wants to convey, an image of power and authority. If we move to the Konark ruler, it is a completely different ideal of kingship. The king is that civilized, cultured human being who is surrounded with the pleasures of the court, so that you can have him seated on a swing. The swing is something very typically Indian. This was one of the things I was thinking of as an object. But that swinging is part of a relaxing and pleasure type of mode. That there are others in which you see him as an archer, but it's the beautiful body that is being shown now, that he has got a body that is strong and elegant and beautiful. And the king, in the much more of the Indian context, like Samudragupta also, had to be a beautiful king. He had to be a master of all the arts. He also had to be beautiful. And it is that image, a very different image, that is being portrayed. And the different types of authority, beauty, power, I thought it was an interesting way to explore.
And you must add Ibrahim Adil Shah with the music, the instrument, with a same era art piece with Saraswati being shown in the Adil Shahi court. So I mean, that also shows the syncretic nature of our culture. When you talk about Indian art history, I can't imagine, how you actually approach it, because you're talking about the subcontinent's history. When you talk about the intercultural connections, you've got pieces from Cambodia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Java, and Champa. And each one of them is reflective of the era that they went in, but also of they are continuums within them. So take us through how you selected these pieces from across the Southeast Asian region.
One of the things I'd like to say about Southeast Asia is that you could take the same image, say a Ganesha, and you would find that a Cambodian Ganesha is different from a Javanese Ganesha, is different from a Vietnamese Ganesha. And just as an example, and what it shows is that these faiths moved with merchants and traders at a very early date into these various geographical areas. Either they are islands or they are mainland Southeast Asia. And then they developed independently in the art tradition of each one of these regions. So that's one very important point. And then, of course, the fact that they alternated between Buddhist rulers who followed Buddhism and those who followed the Hindu faith. And we have both sets of belief systems across that region. They never referred back to an Indian authority. India never exerted control over those areas. the faiths moved there, and then it was the locals who built it and took it further. And it's an interesting thing because it's very different from the way China acted in the same period. For instance, Vietnam, the Champa kingdom of Vietnam, which is a Hindu kingdom, but that area never owed anything back to India. It didn't have any connection with India. It wasn't a subsidiary, it was its own independent. While in the case of the Chinese in that area, they were the ones to whom everybody reported back. So the fact that India didn't play a role after originally, shall we say, the merchants taking these faiths there, allowed each of these areas to develop slightly differently in the way they conceived the body. It was always a bit sensuous, but it was different in each of these regions. And I was hoping that part of it would also, that bit of it would also emerge.
As you leap through the centuries, and I know it's not chronological, but within each section you've tried to be chronological. But as you leap between centuries, you also move to a early medieval to medieval period where the technology changes. So on one hand, you have the illustrated book, for instance. While we know most of our illustrated books as Mughal pieces because they were the most prolific over there, you have the first illustrated books, which are Buddhist, Jain, and then you have the Islamic books. And then you move to, the art of contest, for instance, where you have some of the most iconic armory, and guns. So let's talk about this phase. I mean, consciously, was this best suited to talk about these aspects? Because the sense that I get is that as an art historian, you tried to bring in different elements to create the richness of the tapestry and reflect that richness.
Well, you do put it very well. It is a tapestry. It's a complicated tapestry. And I would imagine that someone else doing 100 Objects book, and it's open there for somebody else to do it, might choose different strands of that tapestry. And the art of contest, to me, I thought of it as the art of contest because I also wanted to bring in these many board games of India, games which are in fact originally Indian in origin, Pachisi Chaupat, which has gone out. And as a child, I had a board called Ludo, and I never at that time realized that this was a game which was originally invented in India, went out of the country, came back in with the British, and which we always had in India. So a contest as a game, a war game, a game of speed, or contest as in cannons and weapons and actual contest. They were originally very different sections. And then I thought it might be fun, interesting, or surprising anyway to people to suddenly find a game, a major game, as part of what was titled The Art of Contest. And incidentally, I mean, we've got these board games that all Shiva and Parvati are always playing these board games. Any of those caves in the Bombay region, Ellora, for instance, there are many, many images in each cave. Each cave has one image of Shiva and Parvati playing this board game. And of course, the most famous board game, which we don't know what it is the one of the Mahabharata, in which the Pandavas lost everything to the Kauravas. And it's amazing how the epic elides this issue. It never tells us what that game is. So to this day, we still have a question mark about which exact game it was.
Right. And we just presume it is a chopper, but we really don't know, right?
Yeah. Yes.
The other thing, the theme that comes through, and that's one thing that we constantly focus on in Live History India, is the fact that for 2000 years and more, India was a capital of the world's luxury market. I mean, we've spoken about the ivory and the fine muslin of 2000 years ago, but look at the opulence of the pieces that you've picked out in the Sensorian, or the section where you look at the luxuries of India, the beautiful inlay work, the exquisite silver work. Take us through some of the pieces over here, because there would have been a lot to choose from. How do you choose the ones that you did?
One of the sets of pieces, of course, were these game pieces, part of the Chaupat or Pachisi game. But yes, you see, it's the interesting thing about some of these items like daggers. So daggers was something, yes, they did have an actual lethal ability, but the dagger was also something that every cultivated courtier at any of the courts, whether it's the Mughal court or it's the Rajput courts, would tuck into his patka, into his sash, and it had to be beautiful. It also talked of him as a man of taste, a man of discernment, and it became part of the costume as well. You almost forget that it is actually a dagger because it has got this gorgeous hilt embedded with precious stones. It could be marble with precious stones. It could be metal with precious stones. It becomes a part of the elegant costume of a courtier. And for that matter, the same thing with shawls, with Kashmiri shawls, which became such a thing. They all wear them. Either you wear them as a shawl or you fold them and make them into a patka sash and put it around you. If you look carefully at any Mughal or Rajput painting, you will keep seeing these. So they were items of connoisseurship apart from having the ability to be an actual lethal weapon. And the inlay work is something which even today is so amazing in Rajasthan, the people who specialize in inlay work. The other thing is precious stones, which India really was the supplier of them until very recent times. Until about 200 years ago, everything came from India. Diamonds, nowadays you have South Africa and Colombia and places like that, which have been recently mined. But until about 250 years ago, India was the source. Burma for rubies, India for gold and for diamonds and these precious stones. All those famous diamonds you think of are all of Indian origin. So it was an extremely wealthy nation, wealthy in precious stones and in gold.
One common thread through this book is the cosmopolitan nature of art and objects in India, right? Because like you've said in this conversation itself, we've touched upon the interconnectedness, the Indian Ocean world, the cosmopolitanism, because somewhere when we look at Indian history, there is a tendency to look inward. We never look at it. And now increasing amount of good work is being done on the Indian Ocean Trade Network, etc. I bring to focus the painting of Jahangir and the obvious European elements that come in the Mughal art in that period, which shows that there's been constant interaction. And if I'm not mistaken, the idea of perspective came with the influence of the Renaissance.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The Jahangir album Murakka, it's useful when thinking of Jahangir albums to think in terms of just a scrapbook that we might put together, where we bring the ticket for something that we went to, which we really enjoyed, a photograph of this, something else on a trip, and we put them all together on a page. The albums are really a similar concept, except that it is fine artists who are cutting and pasting, so that you've got this picture of Jahangir on the top of the page and a separate little cutout picture of Christ bearing the cross. And then you put it together, skilled artists put it together with beautiful borders and then an outer border and yet another outer border, creating this page. Okay, so Christ bearing the cross, the Jesuits. The Jesuits were Akbar, Jahangir's father, welcomed the Jesuits to his court. He asked them to come. Like he asked the Zoroastrians and he asked the Jains and he asked the Hindus, everybody was welcome. He wanted to learn more about these various faiths. So the Jesuits brought with them the Antwerp Bible. It's called the Polyglot Bible at that time. And Akbar and then Jahangir, obviously, and others asked them to copy these images. And so there arose these Mughal pages, which are copies, very often as part of an album page, but sometimes as the sole subject matter. And yes, in copying it, they are also copying this perspective idea, which never was there in the Indian context. I mean, Indian perspective was, in a way, it's multiple perspective. This is the way you always portray a house because you look at it this way. You look down on a carpet. So if you've got a page, I mean, it's not only Indian, it's also Persian painting also. If you look at a carpet, it's always flat, the way you would look down on it. If you look up at a canopy, a shamiana type canopy, it's always as if you're looking up at it. So you have multiple perspective as the most common way in which you imagine something, as opposed to one point perspective, which is a European discovery, invention, whichever word you want to use, and which did get copied when some of these images were being copied. Yes.
That brings me to the European section, the coming of the British. There is a very practical chronicling approach that the British have. You look at the Daniels, they're fabulous because they give you a slice of 18th century India as is, with, and we never did that. I mean, we didn't have artists doing that. So what do you see? And was it a limitation that it was largely a British point of view, that we don't have access to what the Portuguese or the French or the Dutch looked at when they saw India? How did you approach this?
There is a little bit of all of that, but less from the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French. We do have some of those, but we have it in vast quantities from the British point of view. Obviously, because of the British East India Company and the strength of that company and the fact that it started ruling parts of India. And once that happened, the number of artists who traveled to India, commissions in England were getting hard to find. You had to be an artist of the highest level to find commissions in England. And suddenly coming to India and all these Nawabs and Ranas and all these people here, and the Nawab of Arcot, as they called him, or the Lucknow Nawab, who were very happy to employ these artists to paint portraits of themselves and others. So there is a vast amount of material on British artists representing India, as opposed to a smaller percentage, and not a very small percentage compared to the British. But there are some if you search for them.
Another interesting theme that you brought in, which normally you don't see in art history books, is the tribal, the more earthy, the tribal motifs, for instance, especially from the Gond belt. And the second is the fact that women were one part of humanity. And never do you have the story of women. And you've spoken about feminism and the arts of the people, so to say. So let's look at these two sections and what stands out for you.
The section on tribal and folk, I use those words carefully. I prefer to use the word Deshi and Margi as the mainstream and Deshi, because somehow folk and tribal have have collected some sort of baggage as if they are subsidiary and not as important. They are as important. I mean, anybody who has traveled in India knows that you go to any village and you'll see a village shrine with a goddess who you've never heard of. It's a local name and she's very important there. And you move away, 20 miles and she's unheard of. There's some other goddess. So these beings that are mostly feminine, not always, but mostly, and who are they're ever present all across India. And the fact that they are so localized, that they are local protectors, shouldn't make us lose sight of the fact that they are very important in their own little context. And you may never have heard of a Bhuta image outside of the Udupi region of Canara, but that Bhuta is so important, and all of them are given names. All the names end with either Amma or Taye, both meaning mother. So it was a reminder in a way of the fact that, yes, we are talking about all of this, but then there is this amazing layer of belief system and of objects. Sometimes those objects are just a stone with vermilion on them and has a name. So just a reminder that there is this amazing belief system which is so widespread in its own way. In that women, this was a section that gave me a lot of difficulty because there are women mentioned before, but it was almost impossible to find an image. So, I mean, take somebody as well-known as the Rani of Jhansi, but to find an image which isn't a modern film poster, I could have used one. And to find an image of the period wasn't easy. And we have to admit that, yes, women have been given positions of importance today. We've had prime minister, we've had president, we've had governors, we've got ministers of state, ministers of center, all of them, Speaker of the House, are women. And yet, giving women that position hasn't trickled down anywhere. It hasn't raised the status of women. We're still in a patriarchal society and still struggling to get that equality. It's not only India, it's across the world, everywhere. It is there. And in India, it's even more surprising because we've got Durga, we've got Ma everywhere, the mother goddess. And yet it has been difficult. Can we use that as a way of encouraging men worship Durga? But how do we get them to accept women on an equal footing? We're still struggling.
Yeah, well said. When you come into the present, it becomes difficult. And I think there you have a very eclectic choice of objects. And, I love the fact that you've used Amar Chitra Katha, the comics, as a symbol, because it did introduce a generation of Indian kids to history. And I think it did a fabulous job because it went down to the core in the most simplistic way. And then you end with the color pink, which I found lovely. And I have a story of pink because we've done a lot of work with the weavers across India. And I, out of curiosity, keep asking them, what is the most famous color, the most popular color? And from Coimbatore to Patan to every other place, they talk about the dark pink, the what we call is magenta, the darkish pink becoming the most common color that is used. So tell us about why you chose what you chose in the Into the Present section.
Into the Present was probably the most difficult section, and you've picked up on that. There were so many things, and yet, how did you choose? It was easier to look back and to be able to pick out things, but with current history, I mean, which is unfolding as we speak, or which is 20th century history, it did become difficult. And of course, where do I end? I can't tell you how long I spent on the 100th object. What do you end with? And in a way, color, which I think in India we take for granted. We think nothing of a Kanjivaram sari in bright green with a bright red border. Of course, that's normal, right? In any sari, it doesn't have to be Kanjivaram. And color, which again in India we take for granted. We are so used to it. And when you talk to those who come to India for the first time, that is one of the things that they talk about. They can't believe the vivid colors that they see just on a normal street, normal rush hour traffic. Just everybody's wearing such bright colors. And so I paid attention to that and decided that, that color does go everywhere. And then I said pink. Pink is a color. It's not an object, but every object is colored. So it was one of those choices which I said to myself, I'm sure they're going to pick this apart and say, how can you choose a color? Color is not an object. But it is on every object.
Yeah, the last question, Dr. Dehejia, it's such a sweep of history from the Isampur hand axe to the color pink, 100 objects that, tell the story, in the multifaceted story of India. I've been curious to ask and, to find out, what was the most difficult to let go of when you were pruning this list down to 100?
I had a few more Chola bronzes in the book. And as you rightly pointed out, I have written a few books on Chola bronzes, which are exquisite images. And I just said to myself, I have to get away from Chola bronzes. Chola bronzes, goodbye for now. I need to bring in other objects. So it was really Chola bronzes, which today are in the Tanjavur art gallery, which I had used, for instance, for the god and goddess in embrace, or the body. They were Chola bronzes. And then I said, no, this is weighting it too much in favor of one period of Indian history and art, and it has to be more representative. So possibly letting go of Chola bronzes was one of my most difficult things. And you can see that I brought them in anyhow.
Absolutely. Dr. Dehejia, I've always enjoyed your work, enjoyed listening to you in recorded conversations. I'm so thrilled to have had you on this show with us today to take us through the history of India through the objects that you have selected. Many, many thanks for joining us. And we must have you for a live session with our LHI Circle members on the Chola bronzes. We'll make up for not talking about the Chola bronzes enough. Many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Minnie. It was a pleasure.